the autumn of 1891, a storm swept across Tallapoosa County, rattling the old Dadeville courthouse, shaking loose stones that hadn't moved since 1842. When workmen cleared the debris, they uncovered a waterlogged cedar chest, its brass hinge fused by time, its wood blackened as if it had tasted fire. Inside lay a burnt ledger, a twisted length of iron warped into an impossible spiral, and a censored death register naming just two men. Silas Brantley Harrow, the wealthy foundry owner, found burned in his bed, and Elias Cormac Weaver, the blacksmith, locked overnight inside a furnace room meant to kill him, yet who walked out at dawn without a single burn. Every official record of that night had been sealed, buried, or rewritten. But what survived in that chest reveals a truth the county spent generations trying to erase, a night when fire obeyed no natural law, and when the man who lit it suffered a death no flame should have been able to reach. Before we uncover the truth behind Silas Brantley Harrow and the night his carefully crafted plan collapsed in flames, take a moment to subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss another buried history. Tell us which state you're watching from. Now let's step back to the year 1848, where the fire first began. To understand what happened in the foundry at Harrow's Forge on the night of June the 14th, 1848, one must first understand the world that built it, brick by brick, law by law, silence by silence. Long before the night of fire, Tallapoosa County existed in a state of tense prosperity, its wealth drawn from river crossings, the red clay soil, and a growing network of dirt roads linking Alabama's interior with the port cities to the south. The town of Hickory Bend, where these events unfolded, was small enough for every face to be familiar, yet large enough for secrets to pass invisibly from one household to another. In the spring of 1848, Hickory Bend held fewer than 380 residents, according to county rollbooks. There was no rail line yet, though engineers had surveyed the area the previous autumn. Horses and wagons filled the unpaved streets, leaving deep ruts that collected rainwater in summer and froze in winter. Buildings were simple but sturdy, Greek Revival homes with wide white columns, two-story boarding houses with green shutters flaking under the sun, and a handful of businesses, mercantile shops, a tannery, a modest doctor's office, and Harrow's Forge, the largest industrial structure in the county. Slavery underpinned every working hour of Hickory Bend's economy. Plantation estates spread in all directions, their fields producing cotton, corn, and hogsheads of tobacco. Enslaved men and women labored in the sun and rain, hauling timber, boiling cane syrup, repairing machinery, and tending to every demand of the white households. Their labor was as essential to the county's prosperity as its waterways, and just as exploited. Social hierarchy was rigid, enforced not by law alone, but by the unwritten codes that governed every glance, every bow, every gesture. White landowners occupied the top tier. Merchants, artisans, and smallholders rested below. Hired laborers, sharecroppers, and the enslaved population occupied the bottom, with no legal standing and no voice. Churches reinforced the hierarchy, praising order, obedience, and divinely appointed station. Respectability was a weapon wielded as confidently as any iron tool in Harrow's Forge. It was into this world, a world bound by appearances, obedience, and fear, that Silas Brantley Harrow entered and flourished. Born in 1795 in Georgia, he moved westward with his family at the age of 11, cultivating an air of dignity that went unquestioned for decades. His father, Jeremiah Tillman Harrow, a veteran of the Creek War, returned home with a small pension and a forged certificate granting him several acres of unassigned land. Whether Silas knew of the forgery is unknown. The document was later corrected by county officials, but by then, Silas had already become a man of influence. Tall, with iron-grey hair even in middle age, and always immaculately dressed in dark frock coats and polished boots, Silas projected the image of authority. Church deacons deferred to him, merchants sought his counsel, and county magistrates visited his home regularly. His wealth did not come from plantation holdings, as many assumed, but from his foundry, built in 1839, and side enterprises, tool-making contracts, iron fittings for riverboats, and discreet financial arrangements with local plantations. Perhaps the most striking aspect of his rise was the ease with which he cultivated loyalty. Those who worked for him often praised his fairness. Those who dined in his company described him as cultured, educated, and endlessly patient. Yet none recalled seeing him laugh freely or express any genuine warmth. Respect flowed toward him, but affection did not. There were whispers, quiet speculations about a young apprentice who disappeared in 1842, or the sudden death of Silas's first wife, Martha Ann Calloway Harrow, who passed in 1837 after a fever no doctor could name. Her burial record lists her symptoms simply as weakness, agitation, and stoppage of breath, while coroner notes, seldom referenced, describe signs consistent with progressive poisoning. In Hickory Bend, such matters were discussed only between trusted friends or by enslaved families out of earshot of the main house. Reputation meant survival, and Silas guarded his with meticulous care. The Harrow residence stood on a rise 2 miles outside town, a 2-story structure with broad verandas, symmetrical columns, and clean white clapboards. It looked every inch the home of a respectable gentleman. The roof was covered with hand-cut cedar shingles, and the interior featured long corridors with polished pine floors, ornate mantels, and rooms of deliberate symmetry. Behind the main house, the foundry stretched across half an acre, its brick walls coated in soot and ash, its chimneys tall and imposing. Furnaces blazed day and night, casting a warm glow that could be seen for miles, and the rhythmic hammering of iron echoed across the fields, a sound both promising and menacing. The foundry was Silas Harrow's crown jewel, a testament to his intelligence, his precision, and his ability to manipulate both metal and men. It was also, unbeknownst to his neighbors, a stage for darker purposes. Silas's social life reflected the town's rigid hierarchy. He hosted dinners with imported silverware, conducted formal inspections of every business and farm he financed, and maintained the loyalty of both his employees and the enslaved people under his indirect control. Beneath the polished veneer, however, he was a man obsessed with control, order, and meticulous planning. Wry interaction. Every contract, every glance carried the potential for manipulation. He was an inventor of cruelty, though no one yet suspected the extent of his designs. What his contemporaries called precision and intelligence would later be revealed as methodical preparation for acts that would chill even the most hardened observers. The power imbalance in Hickory Bend could not have been clearer. Enslaved men and women were subjected to constant observation, their movements recorded and commented upon. Children were not exempt from the pressures of obedience. Every household demanded discipline enforced through fear. Women, though legally white, were bound by custom and propriety, rarely able to speak freely or act without scrutiny, and Silas Harrow, a man respected by the magistrates and lauded in church, stood above all of it, observing, calculating, and, most importantly, waiting for the opportunity to execute plans that no one dared to imagine. By 1848, Harrow's forge was more than a foundry. It was a symbol of his power, a repository of secrets, and the crucible in which his darker ambitions would soon be realized. The fires that burned within its brick walls were not merely for melting iron. They would, on a fateful night, become instruments of terror and would leave a mark upon the town of Hickory Bend that would not fade for generations. By the spring of 1848, Elias Cormac Weaver had already spent nearly a decade as an apprentice at Harrow's forge. He was 19, wiry and alert, with dark hair that fell into his eyes as he bent over the anvil. Born in a small cabin on the outskirts of Hickory Bend, Elias had learned early that survival demanded careful observation, quick reflexes, and a memory capable of recalling even the smallest detail. He had seen much in his young life: slavery's brutality, the quiet cruelties of merchants and overseers, but nothing prepared him for what he would discover within the walls of the forge. The first indication came in the late afternoon of April 17, 1848, when Silas Harrow left a ledger carelessly on a side shelf. Elias, tidying the workshop after hours, noticed it. The leather cover was scorched at the edges, as if the ink and pages had resisted fire itself. Curiosity overcame fear, and he slipped the ledger into a corner where no one could see him, opening it to find meticulous notes. Lists of men and women, precise ages, and annotations describing their physical strength, skill, and obedience to command. At first, the records seemed like standard apprenticeship logs, but as Elias turned the pages, he discovered sections that were far more disturbing. Recipes for poisons appeared, written in careful Latin phrases and chemical shorthand. Next to them were charts tracking reactions over days, noting changes in skin, pulse, and temperature. Another section, titled in Silas's neat hand, contained diagrams of cages and confined spaces, some large enough for a single person, others labeled for experimental isolation, with dates and names beside each entry. The final column bore a chilling heading, Outcome Controlled. Elias's hands shook as he flipped through the pages. He memorized names. Thomas Bennett, age 27, Lillian Mayfield, 16, John Turner, 12, all meticulously accounted for, their fates noted in small, precise script. It became clear that Harrow's interest in people was not limited to his forge or to his public persona as a kind benefactor. He was cataloguing life itself as though it were metal to be forged, tested, and remade according to his design. Elias realized with a cold certainty that he had stumbled onto a systematic program of cruelty. And worse, he understood that anyone who attempted to speak out would be met not with disbelief alone, but with danger. Silas Harrow had built his influence on intimidation and manipulation, and every respected citizen of Hickory Bend trusted him implicitly. Elias had no allies who could intervene, at least none who knew the full extent of Harrow's obsession. Days passed. Elias observed Harrow more closely, noting patterns that the forge workers had long ignored. At night, fires were stoked deliberately in smaller furnaces, often at temperatures far exceeding what would be needed for ironwork. Harrow himself would walk among them, placing pieces of iron into the flames and watching with an intensity that bordered on ecstasy. Workers whispered that it was the way he tests the forge, but Elias knew better. The measures were precise, designed to see how metal, and eventually people, could withstand heat. Harrow's interest was no longer in crafting tools, but in mastering control over life and death itself. By mid-May, Elias began taking risks. He returned to the ledger nightly, copying portions into his own notebook, sketching diagrams of cages, and cataloguing chemical reactions in his memory. He also discovered letters hidden in the walls of the forge office, written by Harrow to local medical practitioners and overseers. One letter requested a fast-acting tonic to be administered to certain workers without their knowledge, under the guise of vitamins or remedies for exhaustion. Another described a small, useful child for experimental training to be placed under the care of Harrow's most trusted servant. The tone was calm, bureaucratic, and meticulous, like a merchant ordering supplies, yet beneath it pulsed a cold obsession that terrified Elias. Soon, Elias began to feel the first effects of the ledger's exposure. He suffered strange symptoms, dizziness in the forge, nausea after meals, tingling in his fingertips, and moments of blurred vision. At first, he attributed it to fatigue, to the smoke of the furnaces, or to stress. But the symptoms progressed rapidly. His heart raced unpredictably, skin flushed and then paled, and he began experiencing episodes of near paralysis where his limbs refused to obey, leaving him unable to lift tools or even rise from the bench. Worried, Elias sought the advice of Dr. Amos Caldwell, the town physician, who, after brief examination, dismissed the symptoms as consumption in its early stages and prescribed rest, tonics, and a diet of meat broth. The misdiagnosis allowed Harrow to continue unnoticed, the young apprentice left increasingly helpless while the forge's secret operations advanced. Elias's friends, seeing his decline, pleaded with him to rest, but he refused to leave the ledger behind. Its contents had to be documented, even if it meant risking his life. By June, the poisoning had intensified. Elias could barely hold a hammer. His muscles burned and stiffened. At night he dreamed of fire engulfing the forge, the heat unbearable, yet he could see Silas moving calmly among the flames, untouched. Each morning he awoke weakened, his body betraying him as if in slow rebellion against the secrets he carried. Yet he continued, compelled by a sense of duty to expose what he had found. On the evening of June 13, 1848, Elias attempted to share his findings with the overseer of the forge, a man named Peter Landry who had worked with Harrow for 20 years. He described the ledger, the charts, and the letters. Landry listened, his face pale, but when Elias finished, the older man laughed nervously and said, "You've been reading too much into idle notes. Silas keeps records meticulously, nothing more." He advised Elias to put the notion from his mind, warning him that accusations against Silas Brantley Harrow could ruin a family, a household, or a life. The warnings proved prophetic. That night, Elias retired to his small room in the forge's apprentice quarters, but he did not sleep. He reviewed his notes one last time, copying names, chemical recipes, and diagrams, when he heard the faintest creak from the hallway. Someone had entered, a shadow among shadows, but before he could react, weakness overtook him. He collapsed to the floor, partially paralyzed, unable to call out. The next morning he was found by a fellow apprentice, unresponsive and feverish. Despite a hurried consultation with Dr. Caldwell, Elias died quietly on June 15, 1848, the official record stating natural causes, the coroner's notes briefly remarking that the boy succumbed to fatigue and fever, unremarkable save for weakness of constitution. Harrow attended the small funeral, portraying grief, but observers noted the subtle satisfaction in his eyes. One anonymous journal later recorded that Silas had quietly remarked, "A life spent too long in observation is best concluded swiftly." Elias Cormac Weaver, the first to see the pattern of Harrow's cruelty, left behind only fragments, a half-copied ledger, a notebook hidden beneath floorboards, and the faint, lingering memory among apprentices and townsfolk that something in the forge had been deeply unnatural. In the weeks following his death, the systematic operations of Harrow's forge continued with even greater precision, shielded from suspicion. No one dared question the man who had built the largest industrial establishment in the county, whose reputation in Hickory Bend remained untarnished, and whose ambitions were now veiled behind the tragic demise of the young witness who had glimpsed the truth. By the summer of 1848, following the death of Elias Cormac Weaver, Harrow's forge had entered a new phase. The systematic cruelty that had long simmered beneath the veneer of respectability now revealed its breadth, though the townspeople of Hickory Bend remained unaware. Silas Brantley Harrow had transformed his forge from a simple industrial enterprise into a crucible for meticulous experimentation on life itself. Harrow's plan was multifaceted and deliberate. It involved the management of human labor, the exploitation of social hierarchies, and the precise application of slow-acting toxins. His ledger, the one partially preserved by young Elias, recorded the names of 12 individuals over the following year, each selected for specific attributes: strength, obedience, youth, or vulnerability. Among them was Margaret Collins, age 20, a seamstress brought from a nearby plantation; Samuel Whitaker, a hired laborer with keen eyesight; and Lydia Bell Turner, the younger sister of the 12-year-old apprentice previously recorded. Each person's habits, weaknesses, and health were catalogued with the same meticulous care he applied to iron, as though their lives were raw metal to be forged. The methods were systematic. Small doses of arsenic were administered in daily rations or in medicinal tonics, each carefully calculated to produce progressive symptoms. Harrow noted the effects with precision: nausea, lethargy, pallor, and, in some cases, partial paralysis. He monitored how individuals responded to isolation and fear, recording tremors in their hands, the rate of their pulse, and the clarity of their speech. Psychological torment was applied alongside physical. Windows were blackened, whispers spread through the dormitories, and each victim was subtly reminded that escape would invite punishment beyond death. Harrow's network of accomplices was essential to T. He planned success. Dr. Amos Caldwell, the town physician who had dismissed Elias's illness, became an unwitting, or perhaps complicit, assistant. Caldwell's prescriptions of tonics and restoratives delivered slow-acting poisons under the guise of medical treatment. Peter Landry, the overseer, ensured the apprentices and laborers followed orders without question, facilitating the discreet removal or isolation of individuals at Harrow's direction. Legal cover came from Abner Whitfield, a local lawyer who quietly ensured that records and property claims remained free of scrutiny, and that any complaints lodged by families or neighbors would be politely dismissed. Over the next 5 years, the patterns of cruelty expanded. A young boy named Isaac Hargrove, age 10, was tasked with delivering small vials under the pretense of medicinal drafts, and observed the reactions of older apprentices with growing fear. Margaret Collins was confined for hours in a small side chamber, the air thick with heat from a nearby furnace, as part of an obedience test Harrow recorded in meticulous detail. Samuel Whitaker, once keen and alert, became lethargic and withdrawn, his body gradually betraying him under chemical influence. Notes in Harrow's ledger described each incident clinically, the precise times, ambient temperature, dietary changes, and the number of breaths taken in intervals. The cruelty extended to family separation. Children were forcibly removed from parents under pretense of apprenticeship or work, their identities recorded, and in some cases they were instructed to address Harrow as master rather than a familiar name. Psychological manipulation accompanied physical suffering. Letters were intercepted, news of relatives falsified, and survivors were conditioned to obey the whims of a man who appeared benevolent to outsiders. Multiple deaths occurred during these years, each noted with the same meticulous coldness. John Turner, 12, the younger brother previously catalogued, fell gravely ill after a week-long exposure to an experimental mixture of powders Harrow had created. Despite his family's inquiries, the coroner recorded the death as sudden consumption. Margaret Collins, weakened by months of slow poisoning and confinement, disappeared for 3 days, only to be found in the forge's cellar, her body unnaturally contorted, eyes wide with terror, yet no visible marks of violence. Local rumors suggested accident, but whispers grew. Those who spend too long in the forge do not return the same. Harrow's ambition was not hidden. He communicated with selected apprentices and assistants through coded entries and private notes, detailing objectives for each individual under observation. One ledger entry, dated March 1849, instructed, Lydia Bell Turner, observe response to isolation for 36 hours, record pulse, respiration and any vocalization, administer tonic if tremors exceed threshold, report anomalies in ink only. The language was methodical, almost mechanical, emphasizing measurement over empathy, control over life. Despite the escalating horrors, suspicion within Hickory Bend remained minimal. Outsiders were rare, and those who visited the forge often found only the polished exterior. Ironworks completed to perfection, Harrow's courteous demeanor, and apprentices busy at their tasks. Attempts to investigate were met with obstacles. Reverend Jonathan Pritchard, visiting from Montgomery in 1850, noted irregularities during a sermon visit. When he queried a missing apprentice, he was told, "The boy had fever, sir. It is regrettable, but natural." He recorded his unease privately, but no public investigation ensued. Even the county magistrates, who had received occasional complaints from neighboring families, deferred to Harrow's standing and contributions to the community. By 1851, a small outsider, an itinerant journalist named Clifton Haynes, passing through the county, began to observe patterns. He noted the disappearance of apprentices, the strange health declines, and the meticulous record-keeping of Harrow. Haynes attempted to publish an account, but local printers refused, citing Harrow's influence and the potential loss of contracts. Every attempt to bring scrutiny resulted in polite dismissal or threats disguised as concern. Haynes's reports, stored in coded journals, were discovered decades later in a North Alabama archive, corroborating what the ledger had already revealed. A man of extraordinary intellect had orchestrated cruelty with systematic precision. The townspeople, whether by fear, respect, or ignorance, maintained a conspiracy of silence. Family members of victims were shamed into inaction, Apprentices learned quickly that questioning authority was dangerous, and those who whispered grew faint in memory. Harrow's influence extended into legal, religious, and medical spheres. It was a network designed not merely to conceal crime, but to normalize terror as mundane, to render the forge itself both workplace and prison, laboratory and execution chamber. Over the years, multiple victims were introduced to the forge under seemingly benign pretense. Each received an individualized treatment plan recorded in the ledger, describing chemical dosages, environmental stresses, and expected psychological reactions. Notes on forced reproduction appear among the pages. Certain young women were deliberately isolated, monitored, and observed for signs of pregnancy, which Harrow meticulously recorded. He treated these events with the same methodical interest as testing metal strength, observing behavioral responses, and survival rates. Children were particularly valued for their malleability. Their responses to confinement and fear provided data for future manipulations. Bodies were sometimes exhumed, repositioned in unnatural orientations to observe rigor mortis and decomposition under specific conditions, then returned to their graves with superficial repairs made to headstones. Reports in the ledger describe these actions clinically, without moral judgment, as though measuring the bend of a beam or the temper of steel. Even those who survived bore the psychological imprint of the forge, the haunted glances, the tremors in their hands, the paralyzing fear of fire. By the end of the decade, Harrow's system had become an enterprise of terror maintained under the guise of commerce and civility. Apprentices whispered, neighbors speculated, and the town collectively glanced away, unwilling to confront the reality that a man they had trusted, respected, and admired had converted the tools of his trade into instruments of human suffering. Every death, disappearance, and illness was a note in a larger symphony of control, a demonstration of power so precise it seemed almost supernatural. And yet, for all the cruelty documented, for all the victims catalogued, the authorities remained silent. Reports were filed and lost, letters intercepted, and official statements sanitized. Those who attempted to expose the truth, like Elias Weaver, like Clifton Haynes, were discredited, ignored, or died before their warnings could reach the wider world. Harrow's network of influence ensured that the forge remained unchallenged, the town oblivious, and the systematic terror continued, its methodology precise, patient, and relentless. By the onset of the Civil War, Harrow's operations had persisted for more than a decade, a testament to the terrifying combination of intellect, social manipulation, and the townspeople's willing complicity. Patterns of cruelty had become normalized. Apprentices had learned to avoid observation. Victims had internalized fear as routine, and Harrow's ledger grew thick with names, dosages, and observations, each entry a calculated testament to a man whose mastery over fire, metal, and human life had no moral constraint. Even as the nation approached upheaval, the forge remained a dark center of controlled terror, its methods systematic, its horror masked by civility, and its victims trapped in an intricate web from which few could escape. In this world, terror was measured, cruelty was codified, and the man behind it, Silas Brantley Harrow, stood above all, untouchable, calculating, and precise. The summer of 1861 brought upheaval to Hickory Bend, as it did to much of the South. The rumble of distant cannons and the march of soldiers signaled the onset of the Civil War, and the once stable rhythms of life around Harrow's forge were disrupted. Yet, even amid this chaos, Silas Brantley Harrow maintained control, his operations adapting to the uncertainty of the moment. Apprentices and victims continued to be observed, tested, and catalogued with the same relentless precision. The ledger, now thick with years of meticulous entries, bore witness to a decade of cruelty unmatched in the county's history. But the very upheaval that threatened the broader region also created the conditions for Harrow's downfall. On the night of June 14th, 1862, a miscalculation, small and seemingly insignificant, set the stage for events that would haunt Hickory Bend for generations. Harrow had planned to test the endurance of one of his apprentices, a young man named Ephraim Carter, in a controlled furnace environment. The fire, stoked to temperatures calculated with mathematical precision, was intended to push the limits of human endurance. Harrow watched as the apprentice, trembling, entered the chamber, but the flames, unusually intense that night, reached levels beyond expectation. Yet when dawn arrived, the apprentice emerged, shaken and exhausted, but miraculously unburned. The moment should have been celebrated as triumph, but it was not. That same morning, Harrow himself was discovered in his bed, burned beyond recognition. The bed and chamber bore no trace of external fire, the surrounding house untouched, yet the body was charred as though a furnace had consumed it from within. Witnesses described a smell of smoke lingering in the room, and neighbors recalled hearing faint crackling sounds during the night, though no flames were seen. The cause of death became a topic of whispered speculation, and official reports were never filed. The coroner's notes, if they existed, were sealed, later lost or destroyed. Competing theories emerged immediately. Some claimed that Harrow had attempted a private experiment, misjudging the intensity of a chemical reaction within the forge or his personal chambers. Others suggested that a supernatural force, long rumored by terrified apprentices, had enacted vengeance. Yet another faction whispered of revenge from one of his countless victims, suggesting that a long-planned act of retribution had finally been realized. No evidence conclusively supported any single theory, and the truth remains elusive. In the aftermath, the forge was abandoned for months, the town too fearful to approach. Apprentices fled, some scattering to neighboring counties, others taken by military conscription, while the enslaved individuals returned to plantations or were sold further south. The accomplices, Dr. Amos Caldwell, Peter Landry, and Abner Whitfield, vanished from public record, leaving behind a trail of incomplete correspondence and financial records. Some were believed to have left town, relocating quietly under assumed names. Others are thought to have met mysterious ends in distant counties, their deaths never officially linked to the events at Harrow's forge. Survivors of Harrow's experiments scattered, carrying trauma that would not fade. Lydia Bell Turner, one of the few who remained in Hickory Bend, later recounted in a private letter that she had awoken to find herself confined in a dark chamber, the smell of metal and smoke thick around her, and that she escaped only by careful manipulation of a latch she had memorized from prior observation. She never spoke publicly of her experiences, fearing disbelief or retribution, but her letter, discovered in the 1920s, confirmed the systematic methods Harrow employed. Bodies exhumed from shallow graves in the surrounding fields bore evidence of unnatural positions. Skeletons twisted in ways inconsistent with standard burial practices. Fingers scratched the interior of coffins, and certain remains suggested premature interment. While the townspeople largely avoided these sites, oral traditions preserved the memory. Children were warned not to linger near the forge ruins, lest they feel the eyes of the dead watching. Stories persisted, half-whispered, half-remembered, though local officials dismissed them as superstition. The town itself was never quite the same. The forge's brick chimneys were toppled by a summer storm in 1865, leaving only charred ruins, yet the sense of dread lingered. The estate grounds, once meticulously maintained, became overgrown, and locals claimed that after sunset the smell of smoke would rise from the ruins, and shadows of figures moving among the walls could sometimes be seen, though no one dared approach. Military encampments during the war avoided the area, claiming it unsettled, while families in neighboring counties repeated the warnings to their children. Historical records from this period are fragmented and inconsistent, further complicating the picture. Letters, journals, and coroner notes that might have clarified events were either never filed or deliberately destroyed. One archived letter, dated 1870 from a regional magistrate to the Tallapoosa County courthouse, simply states, "The matter concerning Mr. Harrow's demise and related incidents is of no consequence to public inquiry and shall not be entered into the official record." It is unclear whether this directive was born of fear, influence, or tacit acknowledgement of wrongdoing. For decades afterward, fragments of evidence resurfaced sporadically. In 1924, an academic historian, Clara Winthrop, discovered part of Harrow's ledger concealed in a secret compartment behind a bookcase at the old forge. The pages were brittle, some partially scorched, yet the writing remained legible, detailing chemical experiments, patterns of confinement, and psychological observations. Winthrop noted that the careful, almost obsessive documentation revealed a man whose intellect had been applied to horror with deliberate intent. Her findings were published in a regional journal, but were met with immediate suppression after complaints from descendants of prominent families who insisted that the matter is private and speculative. In addition to physical evidence, oral traditions persisted. Families whose ancestors had labored at the forge recalled subtle horrors: a child who never smiled, a young apprentice who refused to eat, and the pervasive smell of smoke lingering long after work hours. These fragments, though unverified in official records, align with the ledger entries and letters discovered decades later, suggesting that Harrow's influence had indeed extended far beyond the forge itself. By the end of the 19th century, the site was largely abandoned. Ruins of the forge remained, overgrown with weeds and wild vines, the chimneys reduced to jagged stumps. Locals repurposed the estate for farmland, though many avoided the land entirely, leaving it to nature. Hidden graves, scorched timbers, and forgotten journals created a landscape rich with evidence, yet absent of legal acknowledgement. Harrow's name survived only in whispered cautionary tales and fragmented documentation, never celebrated, never prosecuted, but indelibly etched into the region's collective memory. Thus, the reckoning came not through formal justice, but through exposure, collapse, and the dispersal of witnesses. Harrow's carefully curated facade of respectability could no longer withstand the combined forces of human survival, accident, and the slow erosion of time. Apprentices who had escaped spread warnings through hushed letters. Survivors left marks in personal diaries. Journals concealed in secret compartments quietly endured until rediscovery decades later. The man who had controlled so many, orchestrating suffering with methodical precision, fell victim to the unpredictability of the world he sought to dominate, whether by his own experiment, by chance, or perhaps by the hand of those he had wronged. Even today, the ruins of Harrow's forge stand as a grim testament. The brick walls, charred and crumbling, seem to hold the echoes of decades-long terror. Shadows shift among the debris, and the faint scent of smoke occasionally rises from the earth. Archaeologists and historians who investigate the site often report the unsettling sensation of being watched, of being measured and catalogued in a way that seems impossible, yet profoundly consistent with the records left behind. Every artifact, whether a scorched page, a hidden vial, or a fragment of a coffin scratched from within, tells the story of a man whose intellect, ambition, and cruelty intersected in a way that left a scar upon the town and its people. And while Harrow himself lies beyond the reach of law and certainty, his actions have left a legacy of fear, memory, and unfinished stories. His accomplices vanished, his victims scattered or silenced, and his methods survived only in fragile fragments, ledger pages, whispered recollections, and the charred remains of a forge whose flames were intended to consume not only iron, but life itself. It is a reminder that the true measure of cruelty is not merely in acts of violence, but in the careful, patient, and systematic manipulation of human trust, fear, and survival. By the 1920s, the ruins of Harrow's forge had become little more than overgrown remnants of brick, iron, and scorched earth. Local families avoided the property, recalling stories whispered by their grandparents, tales of fire, confinement, and the unnerving presence of a man who had mastered both metal and human life. While the forge itself lay abandoned, the region retained the imprint of Silas Brantley Harrow's systematic cruelty, etched not in official records but in memory, folklore, and the occasional fragment of evidence that survived decades of neglect and deliberate concealment. It was in 1924 that Clara Winthrop, a young historian from Montgomery, first rediscovered the evidence that would reawaken the horrors of Harrow's legacy. She had been reviewing estate records in the Tallapoosa County archives when she noticed a reference to personal correspondence and ledgers of Mr. Silas Harrow, Escoro, to be delivered to heirs only. Winthrop, meticulous and persistent, petitioned to view the materials, and what she found would later send tremors through her academic circles. Hidden behind a false panel in the old courthouse bookcase were fragments of ledger pages, letters, and journals, some scorched, others brittle with age. The meticulous notes detailed poison dosages, observations of confined apprentices, psychological manipulations, and the forced separation of children from families. One page, dated 1852, listed individuals by name, age, and a series of tests conducted over weeks. The language was clinical and precise, reflecting the same obsessive calculation Harrow had applied to his work in the forge. Another letter, addressed to Dr. Amos Caldwell, outlined the necessary tonic to be administered to specific apprentices, accompanied by exact dosages and expected reactions. Winthrop's careful examination revealed patterns that were unmistakable. Harrow's operations had spanned decades, affecting a dozen or more individuals in ways that were calculated, cruel, and deliberate. She noted that the victims were catalogued with the precision of an engineer's blueprint, names, dates, outcomes, all recorded in ink and memorized in shorthand that only an apprentice of Harrow's intellect could comprehend. Attempts to publish her findings were met with resistance. Descendants of prominent families, some of whom had been silent accomplices or beneficiaries of Harrow's wealth, exerted pressure on the university and local press to suppress her work. Letters arrived with veiled threats, suggesting that publicizing the ledger would disturb the peace of the community and invite scandal upon honorable names. Winthrop, undeterred, preserved her research privately, her notes eventually forming the foundation for later historians' understanding of the forge's history. By the 1940s and 1950s, fragments of Harrow's story emerged in other forms. Archaeologists exploring the old forge grounds uncovered partial graves, skeletal remains positioned unnaturally, some with scratch marks inside coffins indicating attempts at escape. Burned timbers, scorched floors, and hidden compartments corroborated the accounts in the ledger. Oral traditions persisted as well. Elderly residents recounted children who trembled at the thought of the forge, whispered stories of fires that burned without flame, and unexplained illnesses that struck those who had worked too closely to the ruins. These accounts, though dismissed by official authorities, were strikingly consistent with the details recorded decades earlier by Winthrop and the surviving fragments of Harrow's meticulous documentation. Descendants of the victims and even Harrow himself continued to live unknowingly near the site. Families who had once employed or sheltered apprentices carried fragments of trauma across generations, children with inexplicable fears, recurring nightmares, and the sense of being watched. Occasionally, researchers visiting the area reported sensory experiences, faint smells of smoke, sudden temperature changes, and an unsettling awareness of presence that could not be explained by natural phenomena. These lingering echoes of Harrow's methods served as grim reminders that his cruelty had not been entirely contained by time or death. In addition to physical evidence, documents uncovered in the mid-20th century revealed attempts to suppress Harrow's story. County archives contained letters instructing clerks to remove references to the forge from official records, and university correspondences from the 1920s documented attempts to discredit Clara Winthrop's research. A pattern emerges clearly. Harrow's social influence, coupled with the complicity or fear of his contemporaries, ensured that the full scope of his actions remained hidden for decades. Only fragments, partial ledgers, oral histories, and archaeological evidence allowed the truth to slowly re-emerge. Modern historians visiting the site describe the area as unsettling. Foundations of the forge still rise from the overgrowth, the brickwork crumbling but unmistakable in layout. Remnants of the chimneys, scorched and jagged, pierce the air like silent monuments. Hidden pits, partially excavated, suggest attempts to conceal remains or experimental equipment. The forest around the forge has reclaimed much of the land, yet paths trodden by Harrow's victims, apprentices, and survivors remain faintly visible, etched into the terrain by years of repeated use. Some say that even today shadows move oddly in these areas, as if time itself preserves the memory of suffering. In 1953, a local journalist named Thomas Ellery uncovered additional fragments of correspondence from Harrow's associates. Dr. Caldwell's personal papers contained notations suggesting discomfort with Harrow's experiments, though no action was ever taken. Peter Landry's descendants provided access to diaries that hinted at a lifetime of quiet complicity and fear. These discoveries reinforced the historian's understanding. Harrow's system was not merely the work of a single man, but a network of calculated enforcement, social manipulation, and collective silence that had persisted for decades. Even now, some secrets of Hickory Bend remain beyond verification. Not all graves have been located, not all journals recovered, and not all accounts have been corroborated. The region itself seems to resist full disclosure, preserving fragments of memory while erasing others. Archaeological and historical investigation continues to uncover evidence, charred artifacts, ledger pages, skeletal remains, but each discovery raises as many questions as it answers. The precise methods of Harrow, the total number of victims, and the exact sequence of his final days remain shrouded in mystery. Yet one fact endures: Silas Brantley Harrow's influence, cruelty, and meticulous observation left an indelible mark on Hickory Bend. The forge, the ruins, the charred remnants, and the hidden journals attest to a man who wielded intellect, power, and social manipulation to commit crimes that were systematic, calculated, and concealed behind a facade of respectability. Every fragment of evidence, every oral recollection, and every trace of scorched earth corroborates the historical record, showing a pattern of horror that transcends the limitations of surviving documentation. Today, the site stands largely unmarked, a silent testament to decades of human suffering. Nature has reclaimed much of the forge, yet the memories of those who endured remain woven into the soil, the walls, and the ruins themselves. Archaeologists, historians, and journalists continue to return, compelled by the fragments of evidence, the surviving ledger pages, and the stories whispered across generations. The land, though abandoned by human hands, retains an echo of Harrow's presence, a lingering reminder that some secrets buried in Alabama soil may never be fully revealed. And so, the legacy of Silas Brantley Harrow persists, in hidden journals, in charred ruins, in whispered stories, and in the faint, lingering sense of horror carried across generations. Though decades and centuries have passed, the imprint of systematic cruelty, patient observation, and terrifying intellect remains, a cautionary testament to the human capacity for calculated malevolence and to the resilience of those who endured in silence. Some secrets buried in Hickory Bend may never be fully revealed.